Okay, welcome to the social studies lesson. The topic is the scramble for Africa. So, what was the scramble for Africa? The word scramble here implies rushing, racing. So, the scramble for Africa was a period of colonization during which European countries took over African countries as colonies or shared Africa amongst themselves. So how did they do it? They rushed, they raced for Africa. So the scramble for Africa is also called the race for Africa or partition of Africa. The root word in the word partition here is part. So everybody wanted a slice of Africa, so to speak. So the scramble for Africa was a period, a point in time, so a period of colonization during which European countries took over African countries as colonies or shared Africa amongst themselves. Now, what would cause someone to leave their homeland and go and colonize another country? What prompted these people to leave their own countries and come to Africa? What was happening in Europe at the time that led to the scramble? Well, there was something going on that was called the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is credited with having caused the scramble for Africa. The Industrial Revolution caused the scramble for Africa. What does this mean? The word revolution here means sudden change. Industrial means to do with industries. So there were sudden changes happening in industries in Europe. What were these sudden changes? So the word revolution here means sudden change. So what were these sudden changes? Well, sudden changes took place in industries in Western Europe, particularly in Britain, where machines were now used instead of human labor. So industry, trade became mechanized. There was the introduction of more and more powerful machines in industries. So trade became more and more mechanized. This led to more efficiency in those industries. So you have to, for context, you have to think about, so typically the industries in Europe, they involved like small scale traders. There used to be people, specific people with specific skills who carried out these who plied their trade in their homes maybe. So trade was this small scale affair carried out by um, s- highly skilled people. But as more and more mechanization happened, trade work could now move from home and those small factories to big industries. There used to be a specific person who worked with metal, that was a blacksmith. There used to be a single baker who fed the whole town, probably. But now, with the introduction of more and more machines, that same work could now be taken to big industries which carried out those operations at scale. Yeah. And so, where are we currently? We are talking about the Industrial Revolution, which led to the scramble for Africa. Something was happening, something was brewing in those European countries. They introduced machines to their trade, and then that led to work being carried out in factories now in big industries instead of homes and small factories. And so this rapid increase in trade brought fear that Europe was going to finish all her resources and fall into famine and war. Having studied Mfecane, we know about war. We know all about war, what causes war, what are the effects of war. So they feared a similar fate there. So this rapid increase in trade brought fear that Europe was going to finish all her resources and fall into famine and war. They feared the depletion of their resources. So people would this severe lack of resources would people fear that this severe lack of resources would plunge the whole continent into war, into conflict. And so the rapid increase in trade, the rapid increase in the production in the buying and the selling of goods led to a need for more market. These people had a surplus of goods, they had extra goods that they could sell for profit. So there was a need for market, there was a need for raw materials. Um, and so European traders and missionaries brought back news that revealed the economic potential of Africa. Remember, the first European settlers who settled in Africa were these missionaries, they were these hunters and these traders. Missionaries came with the goal of introducing and promoting Christianity to Africans, and so they reported back to their countries of origin the economic potential of Africa, all the ways that Africa could be used to improve um, trade, so to speak, in Europe. So European traders and missionaries brought back news that revealed the economic potential of Africa. So there was a real problem brewing in Europe caused by the Industrial Revolution, a real fear, a real anxiety, and so the missionaries brought back solutions. So check out Africa. Africa has all this economic potential. Okay, so European countries colonized Africa to take advantage of this potential. So Africa was going to save them from the potential ruin that would be caused by the depletion of their resources that would take them into war and famine. Africa was seen as a solution. This is why all the countries rushed, scrambled to get to partition Africa. So what were the actual reasons for the scramble of Africa? So given all that, can we outline, can we state the reasons for the scramble of Africa? So we're going to be dividing these reasons. We're not just going to be stating these reasons, we're going to be sectioning them. So the first one here is the economic interests. So the economic interest here is an umbrella word here, an umbrella phrase for all the other points that relate to money here. So the economic interest, there was a demand for raw materials. European countries wanted minerals, ivory and cotton for their industries. So there was an abundant supply of these things in Africa naturally. So for example, diamonds were discovered in Kimberley in Africa, Jalo. So as far as economic interests were concerned, there was a demand for raw materials. Africa had an abundant supply of those raw materials, namely the minerals, the ivory, and the cotton. The example there being that diamonds were discovered in Kimberley. There was also the need for markets, like I said. European countries wanted a place where they could sell finished products. And the selling of these products, goods were sold at high prices to colonies so that producers could make a profit and grow richer. So that was their business model, to sell the extra supply that they had at high prices in these colonies, so that they could make a profit and grow richer. Additionally, these colonies were not allowed to trade with any other countries except their colonizers. So the enrichment of these colonizers was guaranteed. They came to Africa, they established a market here, they sold to us, and in that way they also had these laws that we could not sell to other countries, except to them. So their enrichment, their profit making was guaranteed. So they sold clothes, they sold jewelry, they sold weapons. And I remember some of these weapons being, I don't technically remember, I know that some of these weapons were used in Fekane. The missionaries, I think the missionaries helped in acquiring these weapons for tribes to use against, for certain tribes to use against others here in Fekane. So all in all, there was the economic interest, the demand for raw materials. I've just explained the one for the need for markets. They sold to us at high prices and we were not allowed to trade with other countries. Political reasons. Colonies were seen as a sign of prestige and political power. European countries wanted to have as many colonies as possible to show how powerful they were. For example, Britain's colony, so Britain's an- Britain was called the mistress of the seven seas, for she had a vast colonial empire. Britain was called the mistress of the seven seas, for she had a vast colonial empire. So there is that political pride, that prestige that comes with having as many colonies as possible. Um, I think it is said of Britain here that the sun never set on her empire, jalo. It's sort of like an exaggeration, hyperbole, English. So the sun never set on Britain's empire. Rather, like she had a very vast empire, jalo. The sun couldn't even set on it. It was that large. So Britain was called the mistress of the seven seas. So there's an example. And upon their political reasons, colonies were seen as a sign of prestige and political power. In order to prove that you were a superpower, you were powerful as a country, you had to have as many colonies as possible. Social reasons. The word social here means like the relationship between people. Yeah, the relationship between people, the structures between people, the way people are arranged, the way people relate with each other. So social reasons. European countries wanted to promote their own culture, their own way of living, since they felt African culture was backwards and primitive or primitive. Um, so they felt that we were uncivilized. I'd say the synonym for primitive here would be uncivilized. So European countries wanted to promote their own culture since they felt African culture was backwards and primitive. That's why they introduced their own language, they introduced the way they dress, they also pushed hard their religion hard. Yeah. They felt that our religion was backwards, it was primitive, we were uncivilized. This is why the missionaries hated traditional healers, because the traditional healers these were the people who upheld the our culture. Yeah, so we had our pre-colonization we had our way of living, but the colonizers wanted to spread to promote their own culture. How? By introducing their language, their dress, and their religion, and labeling our culture as backwards, primitive, and civilized. So regarding religion here, missionaries believed colonization would make their way easier. So missionaries really pushed hard. So Europeans, above all, they thought their own culture was better and it was progressive here. And so missionaries believed that colonization would make their work easier. If their government colonized a certain country, it would be easy to infiltrate, so to speak. It would be easy to get in that country, introduce Christianity, promote Christianity, jalo. So missionaries are the ones who actually pushed hard for colonization. So that's a social reason there. They wanted to promote their culture. Their culture involves religion. Missionaries pushed hard to for their governments to colonize these countries. Also, there was the issue of humanitarian reasons. Missionaries wanted to stop Mfecane wars where many Africans were killed. Other missionaries wanted to stop slavery. So maybe they had their own good reasons here. They wanted to stop Mfecane wars where many Africans were killed. Remember the Mfecane wars were these inter-tribal wars that were fought here in southern Africa, I think amongst the Nguni people. We studied Mfecane there, go look at Mfecane again. So some of these missionaries were moved, so they came from a good place here, they were moved, so they did it for humanitarian reasons, to offer relief. So Africa was in a crisis because of these Mfecane wars, so they came in to offer relief from the Mfecane wars and to stop slavery. How exactly? Well, slavery. Let's talk about slavery. Africans were being exploited. They were used as cheap labor. So, so let's quickly elaborate on that. They were used as cheap labor by the Boers in their farms. So Africans were exploited. They were used as cheap labor by the Boers. So the Boers oppressed the indigenous groups. So the Boers came in and then they oppressed the indigenous groups. Yeah, also European missionaries saw that and they wanted to stop that slavery. So they pushed hard for their government to colonize Africa. So they did it for humanitarian reasons. Missionaries wanted governments to provide Africans with education. So there's another point. Missionaries wanted governments to provide Africans with education and medical services. So they encouraged the colonization of Africa. So some of this came from a good place. Advances in science. Improvements in medical knowledge meant that Europeans could combat malaria and cycle safely in Africa. So they had this confidence now that they could travel safely without fear of these diseases that could wipe them out, diseases like malaria. So they had made improvements, advancements in medical knowledge. This meant that they could travel and cycle safely in Africa. Railway lines had been improved, meaning that the goods can be easily carried to the coast. All of these made it easy to colonize Africa. So they had this confidence about them because their science had improved. Yeah. So all in all, the reasons for the colonization of Africa can be grouped under economic interest, so political reasons, social reasons, and humanitarian reasons, and finally the advances in science. So I don't want you to learn these nodes. Um, I don't want you to learn these nodes in a very in an isolated manner. I want you to see how they are grouped. All right. Let's talk about the Berlin Conference of 1884. Berlin in Germany. I think Berlin is a capital city in Germany. The Berlin Conference of 1884. So by 1884, the scramble for Africa had intensified, it had worsened. European countries nearly fought each other. So there was this tension, there was this strife, and that was clearly reaching its that was almost reaching its boiling point. So the Berlin Conference of 84. By 1884, the scramble for Africa had intensified. European countries nearly fought each other because they were interested in colonizing one country, the same country. For example, during the Fashoda incident, France and Britain nearly fought over Sudan. So Sudan was precious to both of them. They nearly fought over Sudan. So something had to be done, to avoid war. Remember, this whole thing started because they wanted to avoid war that would have been caused by the depletion of resources. So remember, mechanization led to a rapid increase in trade. That rapid increase in trade led to this fear that Europe would deplete all her resources. There would be excessive competition. This would lead to famine. This would lead to war. And so now, after they colonized Africa, they still face this threat of war. So the prime example here being the Fashoda incident, where France and Britain nearly fought over Sudan because Sudan was that precious. And so by 1884, when tensions were at their highest, so in order to avoid colonial conflicts, the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, called a Berlin Conference in December 1884, where European power representatives met to decide how to share Africa without fighting. So something had to be done. Somebody had to mediate. Somebody had to step in and say, guys, we need a better solution for this. I hate these near misses. I hate these threats of war. We are living under the constant threat of war. Tensions are very high. Yeah, so Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor, I think this is the equivalent of a president, I'll look into it, but the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, called a Berlin Conference in December 1884. And who were the attendees? The European power representatives. Yeah, they met to decide on how to share Africa without fighting. Ironically, unsurprisingly, Africans were not invited. So that's the great tragedy there. That's the great irony. They met to decide how to share Africa, but Africans were not invited. So what were the terms of the Berlin Conference? What were the conditions agreed upon during the conference? What were the terms of the Berlin Conference? Number one, for a country to claim a colony, it must occupy it. It should have settlers in its colony. So there should be some movement, there should be some activity of the country in there. The settlers should be set up in that colony. You can't just lay claim to a colonial. There should be your people moving about in that country. So for a country to claim a colony, it must occupy it. It should have settlers in its colony. Number two, it must set up administrative structure in that colony. So it has to decide how power is going to be spread out in that country, in that colony. Who are the leaders, who are the subordinates, that kind of thing. So it must set up administrative structure in that colony. Number three, it had to inform other European countries and the people who were being colonized. So they had to announce that we were now, from now on, we are going to colonize this country, and so they had to inform the other European countries and the people who were being colonized. Number four, free trade was to be carried out in major rivers. So there's this concept of free trade here. I think free trade means that people are not paying duty. I think it's called custom duty. So usually when you import stuff, when stuff gets into your country, so you import stuff. Usually your country here is going to sort of tax you. Is going to take a percentage. You're going to pay a small sum of money here in order for your goods to pass through in here. So if we remove this altogether, this thing called customs duty here, if we remove this thing altogether here, we are now left with free trade. Goods get in for free. So free trade was to be carried out in major rivers to lessen this conflict, probably. So these rivers were the Niger River, the Congo River, and the Zambezi River. So that's the fourth condition there. Number five, all countries were to try and stop slavery. All countries were to try and stop slavery. Remember, the missionaries were the ones who were actively pushing for colonization, and so they wanted to abolish slavery, seeing that the Boers were oppressing the indigenous people, the African people. They pushed against slavery. They wanted to demolish slavery. So it was written into the terms of the Berlin Conference that all countries were to try and stop slavery. Emphasis on try here. It was a very difficult thing to overcome, and I still think, on a very low note, sad note, I still think there is modern day slavery, but that's a topic for another day. Results of the Scramble for Africa. There was obviously a loss of independence by our African countries, a loss of sovereignty. I'm not going to try to spell that word out. Sovereignty. There was a loss of independence by African countries, because their chiefs, their kings lost political power once they were upset, once they were overthrown by the colonizers. So the obvious point here is that there was a loss of independence. There was also this economic transformation that happened in Africa. Africa became poor. It lost the land for farming and hunting. So Africa became poor because it lost land. The land that would have been used for farming and for hunting was now taken by the settlers. Remember, one of the terms of the Berlin Conference, in order for a country to colonize another country, should have settlers in that place. So the settlers are going to take that land, and so Africa became poor because it primarily relied on farming and land. So if you lose your land, you become poor. The other result for the scramble was the cultural changes that so cultural changes. Yeah, African culture here changed in terms of language, in terms of religion, in terms of clothing. More and more, people adopted the European culture in the way they prayed, in the way they worshipped, in the way they spoke, in the way they dressed. So that's another result of the Scramble for Africa. There was also the displacement of communities. So I think this point follows from this one. Yeah, land. Africa became poor, it lost its land. So there was also the displacement of communities. Babirwa were pushed out of Tule block by the British South African company BSA. Babirwa were pushed out of Tule block. The Bakalanga's land was taken by the Bakalanga's land was taken by Tati company in the Tati district. So that's the entirety of the topic. Yeah, the Scramble for Africa. So let's do a quick recap. The Scramble for Africa, the race for Africa, a period where countries took up Africa as colonies, African countries as colonies, and shared Africa amongst themselves. It was caused by the Industrial Revolution. Revolution means sudden change. The sudden change that was happening in these industries were the mechanization. This mechanization, the introduction of more and more powerful machines, which eliminated human labor, which led to a reduction in the use of human labor. These machines meant that there was now the establishment of big industries which could carry out trade on a very massive scale, and this led to an increase in trade, which led to fear of famine and war due to a severe lack of resources. These countries looked to the outside. They saw Africa. They needed market. They needed raw materials here to sustain trade, and so they looked to Africa because the missionaries reported the economic potential of Africa. Yeah, there are many actual reasons for the many layered reasons for the scramble of Africa. We also talked about the Berlin Conference, which was organized by Otto von Bismarck of Germany. So, by the way, Germany, when you learn, if you do like history, Form 5, you'll find that Germany on the international stage is usually the aggressor. So it's very ironic here that Otto von Bismarck called for peace. He mediated to avoid these colonial conflicts, while Germany is known for being the aggressors on an international stage. They are the ones who usually perpetrate violence and start world wars. So that's worth noting there. So the sad reality is that Africans were not invited to the Berlin Conference, which decided their fate. Yeah, and that's that.